back to the podcast. Thank you so much for your support and for tuning in today. I am really interested in this topic, and I was debating whether or not to do it because I kind of didn't know how it would go. But then I was like, you know what? I think it's interesting. You guys probably will think it's interesting too. So today we're going to talk about a religious group, but we're going to talk about the history, like the actual historical account of Christianity. So I will absolutely touch on other historical accounts of other religious groups in the future. It's just that I picked this particular religion today because I probably have to do the least amount of background work, and I was feeling a little lazy. Well, that's pretty much it. So basically, for me, the interest around historical religious stuff is that so much of generations gone, their actions, wars, inquisitions, political maneuvers were influenced by their religious beliefs. And, you know, a lot of us today live in political states that are completely separate from religion, but in a lot of history, the religion and the state were one. And so it completely ruled the moral codes, the what the populations hold dear, the philosophies of populations of people. It affected things like fertility and sexuality and what people ate and drank and all of that sort of stuff. And I just think that that is so fascinating. So that's why I love to kind of listen to this sort of stuff, watch this sort of stuff, and I hope you do too. And I just wanted to sort of disclaim, I'm not going to be talking so much about modern Christianity at all. I kind of don't really want to touch on it at all. I just literally want to talk about how we got from 1st century BCE through to the 2000s. Okay, so what am I talking about when I say Christianity? Basically, that concerns Christian religions and Christians in a whole heap of denominations. But I think the number one thing that will differentiate Jewish people from Christians, from Islamic people, is that Christians believe in a figure named Jesus Christ. So that's how you can tell they're Christian. So Christianity, obviously, getting straight to it, originated with the religious ministry of Jesus in Israel in the 1st century. Okay, so he was a Jew. Jesus was Jewish, and he was a teacher and a healer, and he proclaimed to be the Son of God, and he was seen by the Jewish people, or some particular Jewish people at that time period, as being blasphemous by saying that. And therefore, after a lot of kind of political heat, he was actually crucified, or death by capital punishment. Now, that was at the Roman hands. So if you have been following along with Rome Week, you'll remember that Rome at this point in time had a huge area, and Israel was absolutely, or Jerusalem was one of those places that the Roman Empire had kind of come in, and they were ruling at the time. So you sort of had this like political landscape where there was the like Jewish leaders that were still practicing their religion, and they had their own kind of hierarchy, at least that's what I understand. And then you had the Romans, which were kind of like overseeing that, right? So the Romans were sort of like the last say. So with Christ's death, then comes the belief that he was put into a tomb, and on the third day he was resurrected. So that's what the Christian faith believes in. So there's some, I guess you could call them supernatural beliefs, or like pretty much every religion will believe in the like a supernatural power, that sort of thing. So once he once he was raised from the dead, he was then said to be exalted by God. So he left, but with a promise to return. So a lot of Christians throughout history have believed that his imminent return is coming. So when Christ was gone, so moving straight into like the historical point of view, that's like the basic beliefs I think most people in would probably know, that that's like a generalized belief. Maybe not. Anyway, so the first followers of Jesus were apocalyptic Jewish Christians. I'll let that sink in. Apocalyptic Jewish Christians, that's sort of the term we use. So the inclusion of Gentiles. The word Gentiles essentially means non-Jewish people. So the inclusion of Gentiles in the developing early Christian church caused a schism between Judaism and Christianity. So just to step back a little bit, Judaism and Christianity, and I believe Islam, and I'll have to fact check that, share religious texts. So they share, at least Judaism and Christianity share the Old Testament. So the stories of Moses, Abraham, Jacob, all of that, they both have that in their religion. Where things kind of split off is when Jesus came and said, hey, all this stuff that the Jewish people do as their religious rites and rituals, I want it to be this way. And his whole ministry was about loving one another, right? That's essentially where his like teachings were all about love and being kind to one another. That originally, that's what it sounds nice in the original format, of course. And I found that in studying world religions, which is a topic, a class that I studied, when you actually get down to the crux of each world religion, it is a really beautiful, poetic, and philosophical core. And typically, obviously I'm generalizing, and obviously throughout the history that we'll cover, things definitely change. They definitely change. People's interpretation is so vast. Okay, so now that I've explained that, so the Gentiles were the non-Jews, and then there was the Jewish people, and there's been this schism between Judaism and now this newfound Christianity. So basically, for 2 centuries after Christ left, Christianity was not doing too well, really. There's ups and downs, and when Christ was doing his ministry, he had 12 followers, and they then continued on his teachings, and most of them also died via capital punishment. So it's the Christian sect, or Christianity as a whole definitely suffered once Christ left. However, in 313, so about 300 years, well, exactly, or 300 years later, Emperor Constantine the First basically made Constantinople a legal, a Christian state. So I believe the story is that he, in battle, let me see in my notes here if I've got the particular battle. I don't know if I wrote it down. But basically the story goes that he was in battle, and he was had gone to bed in the barracks and had a dream. And in the dream, he foresaw a bridge and a shining cross. And in that moment, it was like his conversion to Christianity. And from that day forward, he was a devout Christian. That is heavily debated as to whether or not that story is accurate, or if it was a construction well after the event of that battle, because it wasn't formally written down till I think like 30 years or something along those lines after this event says to take place. And Constantine and Constantinople absolutely gained political and financial benefits from the church to claim Constantinople as a Christian state. So, and there's also evidence that Constantine was actually part of a common Roman cult that a lot of the elite Romans were a part of. That is a whole other episode in and of itself. But yeah, we'll get into that later. So then in 380, so like a few years later, an edict was put forth, and the Roman Empire officially adopted Trinitarian Christianity as its state religion. So Christianity then establishes itself predominantly as a Roman religion. Now, when you think about that, it's actually super interesting, because the Romans were believed in multiple gods before, and so obviously moving to a so they were polytheistic. They moved to a monotheistic. No, that's not correct. It's not mono. It's anyway. There's one God in Christianity, and that transition is just like really fascinating to think about. I think, like, imagine going from thinking there was 12 gods and they all had different jobs to being like, oh, okay, no, now there's one God. Anyway, maybe that's not super big of a change, because heaps of people do convert to Christianity that maybe have been like Hindu or whatnot. So I don't know. But anyway, so the Roman Empire officially adopts, Trinitarian Christianity, and there's then it's sort of obviously as the Roman Empire adopts this. Now, also keep in mind that the very same empire, not even that long before this point, like literally burned Christians at the stake. Like the Roman Empire were the ones that literally crucified Christ. And now they're declaring, oh yeah, actually, we're a Christian state. I just find that so interesting. I think it was Emperor Nero who, in his reign, there was a huge fire in Rome that's that went on for 3 days and destroyed a huge part of Rome. And without evidence, he just said, "Oh, it was the Christians, and let's burn them and feed them to the dogs." You know, that was that it was dangerous to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. And then these years later, they declare that that is actually their official religion now. So I just think that's an interesting shift. But a lot can happen in a few hundred years, you know? So basically, as the religion grows and as we see kind of in all areas of life, Christological debates begin. Doctrinal debates, detailed debates, about the human or divine nature of Jesus Christ. And honestly, that pretty much sums up the concept of multiple sects, right? Different Christian denominations, and even today, have different takes on these debates. They believe slightly different theology or slightly different doctrine to each other, essentially changing their form of worship, right? We could go through these, but like literally, I don't even know, like there is like not enough time in my life to sit here and explain all the different viewpoints because there's just so many. So I'm just going to follow the historical timeline as best as I can. So in the Middle Ages, missionary activity spread Christianity towards the German people, and the High Middle Ages, Eastern and Western Christianity began separating. So the ideals of the East and the West really began to be significantly different. And that's what in 1054, so 1054, so 700 years, so from when the edict came out in 380, so about 700 years it takes to spread Christianity throughout, you know, up to Germany and whatnot, and for us to get heated, for the groups to get heated and debating, and passionate, you know, about their differences of belief. And so then in 1054, there's the East and West Schism. So there were the reason for this is that there was growing criticism of the Catholic structure, and the Roman Catholic beliefs, and so that's what leads to the Protestant movement. So there was kind of like, there's probably more, but like essentially there was like two camps. Now, if you've ever watched anything to do with like this time period, like Mary of Scots, or you know, anything French related in this 16th century, it will involve Catholics and Protestants, and the political, like, are we a Catholic state or are we a Protestant state, and Catholics killing Protestants and Protestants killing Catholics, and it was a huge deal at the time, which is interesting to think about today, because so many people would like literally just throw them into the same bucket, like, oh, you're a Christian, you know, not, oh, are you a Protestant? I even think it's still like a thing in a lot of maybe Scotland or Ireland, maybe. Anyway, I'm not 100% sure on that. I've just seen a couple of TikToks about like the Protestant thing. So anyway, could be completely incorrect. Comment if you are from those countries and if I am correct. So yeah, 16th century, we split. And then the Renaissance era with colonialism inspired by the church. Christianity then kind of goes worldwide. So today there's 2 billion Christians, and it is the world's largest religion. So it went from, just this like basically little tiny blip in the Roman Empire to being the world's largest religion. So let me have a look at my notes, guys. Sometimes it's really hard to just like, it's easier interviewing on this podcast because like I have time to think, but when I just have to talk and talk and talk, I kind of like, you know. So I've kind of touched on the influence of Constantine. We've gone in the early Middle Ages, which I've kind of skimmed over, but they are sort of like really important, in the Byzantine era. So let's just skip back a little bit into the early Middle Ages, or quite a lot. Let's skip back a few thousand years. So remember 536 AD. Remember Justinian the First. That's the Byzantine era. Oh, that's my doorbell. So basically in the Byzantine era, there was a heavy military reverse against Muslims. And the Byzantine Emperor Leo III banned the pictorial representation of Christ, saints, biblical scenes. So then Pope Gregory came in and condemned Leo's actions, and there was a lot of Christian artistry, historical artifacts, iconography was sort of destroyed in this like political hot and cold. And we kind of, like, to be frank, this is the repetition that we sort of see. It continues, you know. Now, I spoke about in the High Middle Ages the growing tensions in the East and the West, and we have the schism, the Protestants and the Catholics. Then, okay, so basically, I sort of have skipped over too much. Let me go back. So, you'll often hear the word Inquisition used in relation to Christianity. There were many inquisitions. So just in the Middle Ages, there was the Papal Inquisition, which I think it was in the 1200s. The I can't even say this, Episcopal Inquisition. Essentially, what went down is the church, being the Catholic Church typically, was extremely upset at these times and concerned that heresy was taking place. So heresy being they had conflicting beliefs. They were potentially out to attack the Catholic Church, or they just were different, I suppose. And they essentially were killed for it or imprisoned, depending on the Inquisition. There was a lot of them. There was also a lot of this type of thing that took place against other religions as well. So the Jewish people were heavily the word has escaped my brain, but they were murdered for being Jewish. That is very much in Christianity's history, sorry. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Inquisitions as we go along. So basically, the Renaissance and the Church. We see the Renaissance, and it was a time of enlightening, right? And we see, like, you know, the beautiful artwork and all this sort of thing, but it was a cultural change as well. In Italy, it was a classical orientation and an increase in wealth, because of the increase in trade. And the city of Rome and the papacy and the papal states were all affected by the Renaissance. So, on one time, it was a great artistic patronage, archi- like architectural magnificence, you know, all of that jazz. And the church commissioned, you know, Michelangelo and Raphael and Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci. But on the other hand, um, with wealth comes criticism of corruption. And that's kind of what we see in this Renaissance period. And this sort of continues until the Reformation, where is birthed Protestantism. So Martin Luther, in the early 16th century, attempts were made by theologians such as Martin Luther and many others to reform the Catholic Church, known as just the Church at that point. They considered the root of corruptions to be doctrinal, rather than just a lack of ecclesiastical sorry, discipline, which is interesting because, like, I don't know if that is 100% really correct, because I think there was a lot of concern about these really wealthy families and their influence over the Pope or the ecclesiastical part of the church, and I think that was a lot of the issue. But there was that basically the theologians and Martin Luther really stuck to the fact that doctrinally he had issues. That was what his thing was. So, the word Protestant is derived from the Latin, my Latin coming up, protenstatio, which means a declaration. So he basically has this letter of, this letter, I suppose, that, let me read this to you, which refers to the letter of protestation by Lutheran princes against the decision of the Diet of Speyer in 1529, which reaffirmed the Edict of the Diet of Worms, offering the seizure of all property owned by persons guilty of advocating Lutheranism. The term Protestant was not originally used by the Reformation era leaders. Instead, they called themselves evangelical, or that they were returning to the true gospel. So essentially, in places where it was not cool to be a Protestant, you would get your house, your everything taken off you. If you had any like high standings in the community, that was stripped. It was really dangerous to be a Lutheran or a Protestant, which we'll just use that term for now. And yeah, there was definitely this idea that they were returning to the true doctrine versus the Catholic's interpretation. So basically, they were persecuted for their beliefs until, probably were still persecuted past this point, but a really big part in history is when Henry VIII considered himself completely a Catholic king. And in 1521, he defended the papacy against Luther in a book that he wrote called The Defense of Seven Sacraments. However, when he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, the church wouldn't allow it. And he was really mad about that. He did not want that. He wanted a new wife, and the church wouldn't allow him to do that. So basically, um, he said, "Stuff you," and he essentially did his own thing and granted his own, like basically made his own religion. He would say, "I'm the King of England," and we now have the English Church, which identified as a Protestant sect or Protestant church, and kind of was this middle ground between Lutheranism and like Reformed Christianity, and allowed divorce. Key point then, because then he went on to, date and kill, date and kill. That was his vibe. So then we have other monarchs considering themselves as Reformed, Catholic but not Roman, and that's like a whole thing. But it did a very special point. There was censorship and prohibition of books. Whenever books are burnt, it just gets me, like, how dare you burn books? The people, like, if a hell does exist, anyone who's burned books throughout history, they should be in it. Anyway, so we kind of go through this radical reformation after this, and there was a counter reformation from the Catholic Church, in terms of documents and meetings. Protestants, there was like back and forward. Basically, the Protestants were like, hey, we need to get back to like what we should be believing, and the Catholics were, again, lots of debating. Then comes science, which is interesting. So we basically see Galileo. And if you don't know who Galileo is, he was a 1600s scientist, kind of before science was a thing. Essentially, because Christianity was the belief system, everything was a causation of God's will. It was either of God or of the devil. It was good or it was evil. Everything had a religious reasoning, if that makes sense. So Galileo comes in with a scientific standpoint. He makes a telescope, and he had other discoveries, of course, and he had major difficulties with releasing these discoveries. So the understanding of the heavens had been held since antiquity, and he raised doubt, and that was seen as anti-Christian of him, to raise doubts in the tradition. So in reaction, scholars maintained that the motion of the earth and the immobility of the sun were heretical. So, meaning that in our understanding back then, we were the center and everything revolved around earth. Galileo was like, hey, no, sun is here and we revolve around it. And they were like, heresy! Yeah. Basically, reason being is it just contradicted what people assumed was in the Bible, or their understanding of the Bible at the time. Galileo's part in the controversies over theological, philosophical positions culminated in his trial and sentencing, and he was sentenced on the suspicion of heresy. So I believe he then like lived out his life just like locked in a room. Like it wasn't necessarily a bad cell, but like he was like convicted for life, I think. So man, we're like literally only up to the 1700s, guys. There's so much. Okay, so in the 1700s, we sort of see what's called the revivalism. So in this revivalism, it was called the Great Awakening. And it's when we saw the development of other sects outside of just Protestant and Catholicism. We see the development of evangelical Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists. They were kind of like the main ones at the time, and it was a very big and interesting and exciting topic in North America at this time. So essentially, to kind of sum it up, I'm going to try to like explain the differences. Actually, you know, it's going to be really hard, guys. This is going to be hard. So basically, we had this religious enthusiasm amongst Protestants in these American colonies, because remember, America's being colonized around this time. And so they would come over from these countries that weren't able to express themselves religiously because the state that they lived in was a religious state. Then they came over to America and colonized America, and they were allowed to believe whatever they wanted. So that's like huge. I imagine coming from, even today, like coming from somewhere under extreme religious law and then being able to move somewhere and you can believe whatever you want. So it's like, what's being offered? You know, that is exciting, and you can see why there was such excitement, right? So in this first Great Awakening, as it's called, there's this huge wave, like I said, of religious enthusiasm amongst the Protestants, and it was emphasizing the traditional Reformed virtues of godly preaching, liturgy, a sense of personal guilt, and redemption by Jesus Christ. So basically, in and amongst this excitement, there were a lot of established congregations that then flicked off from those main ones that I just said before. So basically, the more freedom there was to spitball ideas, the more religions were set up, the more congregations were set up. So there became like German Reformed, Dutch Reformed, Presbyterianism. The Baptist and Methodist churches had different reformations. Then in America at the time, there was obviously slave populations, and Christianity started spreading through those populations as well. Then we kind of go on to the 1800s. So we sort of move through the 1700s, going to 1800s, and now it's like even more groups are springing up. And this movement is sort of, sorry, did I say 1900? No, I should have said 1800s. 1800s. It's like buzzing like a bee, you know? And so this is called the Second Great Awakening. So there's like kind of like two trending periods, right? In the Second Great Awakening, unlike the first, which focused on the unchurched and sought them to become churched, and like it was all about like a deep sense of personal salvation, and all that sort of stuff. The second Great Awakening was about restoring the original. And so that's when we kind of see this restoration period. And we sort of have Shakerism, Mormonism that comes out of this period, and like this holiness movement. And then we have a third Great Awakening, which is in the 1850s. And that's where we get Pentecostalism, which has its roots in Methodist and holiness movements. I also believe that Mormonism sort of has a lot of similarities to Methodists and Baptists as well. So anyway, Pentecostalism would later lead to the charismatic movement, which we'll get to. Okay, so just a little bit more on restorationism. So restoration refers to the belief that there is a purer form of Christianity, and it should be restored to the earth like it was when Christ was around. There are quite a few restorationist groups, and there were in the 1800s a lot of restoration groups, a lot more than today, because they kind of didn't survive or didn't like stay or make it through time. Probably the most known about restorationists today are the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. So then we also have Eastern Orthodoxy. So we have the Russian Orthodox Church, and they are about not obviously, but they're about doing things the way it is done, if that makes any sense at all. It's the best way that I can explain it. Then we sort of move on in time and we kind of get this liberal Christianity, which is kind of this umbrella term. It's sort of more liberal in the sense of like leftist political agendas, but yeah, freedom within, like, basically the freedom to believe in Christ, in the God of the New Testament, but also have beliefs that are not the same as the religious sects. Then we sort of go and move further. So we kind of are now getting into like the more contemporary history. Throughout the world wars, obviously, was a huge part of this religious history, and the Nazi regime and the German Protestantism and Nazism is very intricate and delicate, but obviously that happened. So many Catholic priests were executed as well in concentration camps alongside of Jews. I think 2,600 Catholic priests were imprisoned in one of the Holocaust camps. Polish priests were executed, Polish nuns imprisoned or executed, and many Catholic lay people as well. There's also lots of stories of Catholic Church housing Jewish people during that time, which is kind of a lovely part of an absolutely horrific tragedy. Is it seems in these like really intense and awful experiences, the religions or the people are able to sort of set aside their differences for the time being to help one another. which is always lovely. And so that kind of brings us into the modern day. Like, I've obviously skipped over a lot, and every single church will have probably libraries full of their own theology, their own doctrine, but that kind of gives you an overview of why, one, there's so many different types of Christian churches. Two, why the Catholic Church, I know that a lot of people don't completely understand the difference between saying, hey, I'm Catholic, and, oh, I'm Christian. So, and basically, you know, what was happening in the 1800s, where people were breaking off for different doctrinal beliefs, it still happens today. So, you know, times are changing, they always are changing, that's the idea. And so different things become important at different time periods. There's different social justice concerns in different time periods, and so religion also adapts, and splits off, and, you know, does its thing. I don't, yeah, I hope that gives you an overview of what on earth it is, Christianity, and that's kind of like the major points of history. And I'm definitely going to talk more about Constantine and Constantinople for sure. I believe that was a humongous pivot point for our modern version of Christianity. But let me know if there's any religions that I've mentioned that you'd like more information on, or you'd like to hear a podcast about any of the kind of topics that I've brushed over today. Put it in the comments. I will absolutely, I put every suggestion on a list and attempt to get through the list. As always, thanks for listening, guys. If you could subscribe, I would literally be in love with you. Please comment if you enjoyed this, or maybe it was a little bit too taboo for you. I'm not sure. Let me know, and I'll see you next time. Bye.